dust devils danced across the parched land, swirling red earth against a sky the color of bleached bone. Jed reined in his Appaloosa, Bess, the scent of mesquite heavy in the air. Had been tracking a stray calf for hours, the sun beating down on his weathered neck. They saw it. A cluster of cottonwood trees, their leaves shimmering like restless spirits, and something hanging beneath them. His gut clenched. Bess snorted, uneasy. Jed dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Closer, he saw not one, but 3 small figures suspended from a thick branch. 3 young Apache girls, their limp bodies swaying slightly in the breeze, their arms bound above their heads. Each wore a simple buckskin dress, their dark hair matted with dust and something else. Jed recognized it instantly. Dried blood. A piece of rawhide was pinned to the chest of the middle girl. Jed reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and untied the knot. The hide was stiff, stained crimson. Crudely scrawled on it in charcoal were 2 words, Apache. Thief. Jed's your titan. He knew this land. Knew the simmering hatred between settlers and the Apache, a feud fueled by fear and misunderstanding. Had seen his share of violence, but this was different. This was cold-blooded. These were children. He cut the girls down, one by one, their small bodies surprisingly light. He laid them gently on the ground, noticing the intricate beadwork on their moccasins, now scuffed and stained with the red dirt. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene. He wondered if they'd suffered much. Jed looked around, scanning the horizon. No sign of life. Just the endless expanse of the Texas plains, shimmering in the heat. He knew he couldn't leave them here. Not like this. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a canteen, and carefully washed the blood from their faces. He then wrapped each girl in his spare blanket, the rough wool a meager comfort against the harshness of the world that had stolen their lives. He looked up at the cottonwoods, their leaves rustling like whispered warnings. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a message. And Jed, a man of few words, felt a slow burn of anger ignite within him. Someone would answer for this. Jed dug 3 shallow graves beneath the cottonwoods, the dry earth offering little resistance to his shovel. He worked in silence, the only sound the rasp of metal against dirt and the mournful cry of a hawk circling high above. He wasn't a praying man, but as he lowered each small body into the earth, he murmured a silent plea for their spirits to find peace. He covered them with the loose soil, marking each grave with a simple cross fashioned from branches head stripped bare. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of their innocence pressing down on him like a physical burden. He rode hard, Bess' powerful strides eating up the miles. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the grim task he had just completed. He headed toward Salvation, a small dusty town clinging to the edge of civilization. He knew Sheriff Brody, a man worn down by the harsh realities of the frontier, but a man with a sliver of decency still flickering within him. Jed figured Brody was his best shot at finding some semblance of justice for the Apache girls. Salvation was as desolate as its name suggested. The saloon door swung open and shut with a mournful creak, spilling out the raucous laughter of men seeking solace in whiskey. The air hung heavy with the smell of sweat, sawdust, and despair. Jed found Brody hunched over a poker table in the back room, his face etched with weariness. "Sheriff," Jed said, his voice rough from disuse. Brody looked up, his eyes bloodshot. He recognized Jed, a man known for his quiet strength and unwavering sense of right. "What brings you to this godforsaken place?" Jed didn't waste words. He told Brody about the girls, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He laid the piece of rawhide on the table, the crudely scrawled words stark against the worn wood. Brody examined the rawhide, his face hardening. Damn it all, he muttered under his breath. He knew the unspoken rules of the West, the simmering tensions that often erupted into violence. But this was different. This crossed a line. Who would do something like this? Jed asked, his voice barely a whisper. Brody sighed, running a hand over his grizzled face. Hard to say for sure. Could be any number of folks around here with a grudge against the Apache. Tensions have been high since that raid on Miller's farm last month. Jed's eyes narrowed. He knew the raid Brody spoke of. The Apache had stolen horses and cattle, driven by desperation and hunger. But these girls, they were just children. They couldn't have been involved. "He'll look into it, Jed," Brody said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But don't get your hopes up. Justice is a rare commodity in these parts." Jed nodded, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He knew Brody was right. But he also knew he couldn't just walk away. He owed those girls more than that. He owed them his silence no longer. He would find those responsible, one way or another. The weight of their innocence had become his burden to bear. A burden he would carry until justice, however elusive, was found. The next town, Dust Devil Creek, was little more than a wide street lined with false-fronted buildings. Dust Devils, true to the name, whirled through the street, chasing tumbleweeds and scattering grit. Jed rode best slowly, his eyes scanning the faces of the men lounging on the boardwalk, the women peering from behind dusty windows. The air hung heavy, not just with dust, but with a palpable tension. He could feel it in the way they avoided his gaze, in the hushed conversations that ceased when he drew near. Fear, suspicion, maybe guilt. It was all tangled up like a rattlesnake in a thorn bush. He stopped at the livery stable, the only place showing any sign of life. A skinny man with tobacco-stained teeth emerged, squinting at Jed. "Something I can do for you, mister." "Grain and water for my horse," Jed said, his voice low. "And some information, if you're selling." The stableman's eyes flickered. "Information's a valuable commodity these days." "Depends what you're looking for." Jed reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver dollar, and laid it on the worn counter. "I'm looking for who killed 3 Apache girls." The clink of the silver echoed in the sudden silence. The stableman's eyes widened, darting around as if expecting someone to overhear. He snatched up the coin, palming it quickly. "Apache girls, huh? Ain't heard nothing about that. Sheriff Brody's your man if there's trouble." Jed's jaw tightened. Had already spoken to Brody. He needed something more, something beneath the surface of official denials. "These girls were children," Jed said, his voice hardening. "Someone knows something." The stableman shifted uneasily, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Look, mister," he said, his voice low. "Ain't no good comes from poking around in other folks' business. Especially when it comes to the Apache. Best to leave it be." Jed's silence was heavier than any threat. He fixed the stableman with a steady gaze, the unspoken weight of his inquiry hanging in the air. Finally, the stableman cracked. All right, he mumbled, looking away. "Heard some talk at the saloon last night. Couple of ranchers, bragging about teaching the Apache a lesson. Said something about taking care of their thieving problem. Didn't mention no girls, though." "Names?" Jed pressed. The stableman hesitated, then spat out 2 names, Cletus Rawlings and his brother, Caleb. Jed nodded, the names unfamiliar. "Where can I find them?" The stableman pointed a shaky finger towards the north end of town. "Rawlings Ranch. About 5 miles out. But I ain't told you nothing. Understand?" Jed didn't reply. He turned and walked back to Bess, the stableman's words echoing in his mind. Cletus and Caleb Rawlings. He had 2 names, a direction, and a growing certainty that he was on the right track. The dust devils swirled around him, whipping the silence into a frenzy, a silent prelude to the storm that was brewing within him. He mounted Bess, the leather creaking beneath him, and rode north, leaving Dust Devil Creek to its secrets and its fear. The setting sun cast long shadows across the plains, stretching towards the Rawlings ranch like accusing fingers. The whispers in the wind had led him here. Now, it was time for silence to speak. The Rawlings ranch was a sprawling, ramshackle affair, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the wind-swept plains. A lone windmill creaked mournfully, its skeletal arms reaching towards the darkening sky. No lights shone from the windows. The silence was unsettling. Ged dismounted, the reins looped around the hitching post, Bess snoring softly. He approached the main house, his hand resting on the worn butt of his Colt Peacemaker. The front door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning him forward. He pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit interior. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, and something else. Something acrid and metallic that made his stomach churn. Blood. He moved cautiously through the house, his boots silent on the rough-hewn floorboards. He found no one, but the signs of a hasty departure were everywhere: overturned chairs, a broken bottle lying on its side, a half-eaten plate of food left on the table. Yed stepped back outside, scanning the outbuildings. A faint light flickered from the barn. He moved towards it, his senses on high alert. He peered through a crack in the wooden wall. Two men, Cletus and Caleb Rawlings, were inside, saddling their horses. They were talking in hushed tones, their faces grim. "Damn that stableman," Cletus growled, his voice thick with anger. He talked. "He ain't the only one who knows," Caleb replied, nervously adjusting his saddle. Words spreading faster than a prairie fire. "We gotta get out of here, Caleb," Cletus said, his hand hovering over the pistol strapped to his hip. "Before that silent bastard catches up. Where we gonna go?" Caleb asked, his voice tinged with fear. "Ain't no place left for us." "Mexico," Cletus said, spitting on the dusty floor. "Well, disappear south of the border. No one'll find us there." Yed stepped back from the barn, his mind racing. He knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't let them escape. He owed those girls more than that. He moved silently towards the back of the barn, where a small window offered a clear view of the Rawlings brothers. He drew his Colt, the metal cool against his palm. Inside the barn, Cletus and Caleb finished saddling their horses, their faces etched with desperation. They mounted up, ready to flee. Yed raised his Colt, aiming carefully. He fired 2 shots in quick succession, the reports echoing in the stillness of the night. The Rawlings brothers slumped in their saddles, their bodies tumbling to the dusty floor. Their horses whinnied in fright, rearing back and bolting out the open barn door. Jed stepped into the barn, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. He looked down at the bodies of the Rawlings brothers, their faces frozen in a mixture of surprise and fear. He felt no satisfaction, only a weary sense of closure. He holstered his Colt, the weight of it a familiar presence against his thigh. He turned and walked out of the barn, leaving the bodies where they lay. He didn't look back. He mounted Bess and rode away, the silence of the plains enveloping him once more. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of dust and death. He rode towards the rising sun, leaving the darkness of the Rawlings ranch behind him. He had done what he had to do. He had given those girls the only justice he could. And now he would ride on, carrying their memory. The rhythmic beat of Bess' hooves against the hard-packed earth was a lullaby against the vast, indifferent sky. Days bled into nights, marked only by the changing colors of the horizon and the occasional flicker of a distant campfire. Jed rode on, fueled by a grief that wasn't his own, a burden head willingly taken on. He was a solitary figure against the immensity of the plains, a ghost haunting the edges of civilization. He hadn't always been this way. The image of the 3 small graves beneath the cottonwoods kept surfacing in his mind, a raw wound that refused to heal. And with it came other memories, buried deep within the recesses of his own past. Memories Head tried to keep locked away. He was just a boy then, no older than the eldest of the Apache girls. His family, homesteaders with dreams as vast as the prairie, had carved a small piece of life out of the unforgiving land. His father, a man of quiet strength, had taught him the ways of the land, the language of the wind and the stars. His mother, with her gentle hands and unwavering spirit, had filled their small sod house with warmth and laughter. It was a fragile piece, easily shattered. One scorching summer afternoon, a gang of outlaws, driven by greed and fueled by whiskey, descended upon their homestead. They took everything, leaving behind only destruction and despair. Yed watched, hidden in the tall grass, as they dragged his father out of the house. His pleas for mercy met with cruel laughter. He saw the flash of metal, heard the gunshot echo across the plains. He saw his mother, her face contorted in anguish, try to intervene, only to be brutally struck down. He was powerless, a small trembling figure swallowed by the immensity of the prairie. Head buried them himself, his small hands fumbling with the shovel, the weight of their loss crushing him. Head marked their graves with simple wooden crosses, just as he had done for the Apache girls. Head stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the mournful cry of a hawk circling overhead. Head made a silent vow that day, a vow to stand against injustice, to protect the innocent, to be the voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Head left the homestead behind, his childhood stolen, his innocence shattered. Head wandered the west, a solitary figure, honing his skills, learning the harsh realities of the frontier. Head become a man of few words, his silence a shield against the pain he carried within. Now, years later, the memory of that day returned with a vengeance, triggered by the senseless murder of the Apache girls. He saw their faces in his mind, their innocence mirroring his own lost childhood. He felt the weight of their deaths, a burden he now shared with his parents. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could honor their memory by continuing to fight for justice, by being the silent guardian of the innocent, by ensuring that their deaths were not in vain. The rising sun painted the eastern sky in hues of gold and crimson, a promise of a new day, a new beginning. Jed rode on, the silence of the plains his constant companion, the memory of the lost his guiding star. The next town, Salvation, clung precariously to the edge of civilization, a cluster of ramshackle buildings huddled around a whitewashed church. Jed rode in slowly, the dust of the trail clinging to him like a shroud. He dismounted in front of the general store, the silence of his arrival a stark contrast to the usual boisterous welcome of a weary traveler. The townsfolk, gathered on the boardwalk, watched him with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. They knew his reputation, the silent rancher who rode into town, dispensed his own brand of justice, and then vanished as quickly as Head appeared. The church bell tolled, its mournful clang echoing through the stillness of the afternoon. A man emerged from the church, his black coat flapping in the gentle breeze. Reverend Elijah, a man of God in a town that had forgotten God's mercy. He walked towards Jed, his steps measured and deliberate. "Jed," the Reverend said, his voice soft yet firm, "I've been expecting you." Jed nodded, his eyes meeting the Reverend's gaze. He knew the preacher's words would be a plea for peace, a warning against further violence. Head heard them before, in other towns, after other acts of retribution. "Those men deserved what they got, Reverend," Jed said, his voice low, barely a whisper. "Perhaps," the Reverend replied, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. But vengeance breeds vengeance, Jed. It's a cycle that never ends. It ended for those girls, Jed countered, his voice hardening. The Reverend sighed, the lines on his face deepening. Their deaths are a tragedy, Jed, but more bloodshed won't bring them back. It will only perpetuate the cycle of violence that has plagued this land for far too long. Someone has to speak for them, Reverend, Jed said, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Someone has to make sure the deaths weren't in vain. Justice is God's work, Jed, the Reverend said, his voice rising slightly. Not yours. Jed turned his gaze back to the Reverend, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. God's been silent for a long time, Reverend. Someone has to fill the silence. The Reverend placed a hand on Jed's shoulder, his touch gentle yet firm. I understand your pain, Jed. I understand your need for justice. But I beg you, let it go. Leave this town. Don't bring any more suffering upon us. Jed remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the Reverend's words pressing down on him. He knew the preacher was right. Vengeance was a dangerous path, one that could lead to his own destruction. But he also knew he couldn't turn his back on the injustice he'd witnessed, the innocent lives that had been taken. He looked at the faces of the townsfolk gathered on the boardwalk, their eyes watching him, waiting for his response. He saw fear, apprehension, but also a flicker of hope, a silent plea for someone to stand up against the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. He looked back at the Reverend, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. I can't promise he'll forget, Reverend, he said, his voice barely audible, but I can promise he'll try to find another way. He turned and walked towards Bess, the reins looped around the hitching post. He mounted up, the leather creaking beneath him, and rode out of Salvation, leaving the town to grapple with its own demons, its own silent prayers for redemption. The setting, the dust settled on Salvation's main street, leaving Jed's tracks fading in the afternoon sun. Sheriff Brody watched him go, chewing on a piece of straw, his eyes narrowed. The silence Jed carried wasn't the quiet of a peaceful man, but the stillness before a storm. Brody had seen it before. He knew the look of a man wrestling with his demons. He spat out the straw, the dry spittle a small, dark stain on the dusty ground. He had a bad feeling about this whole thing. The Rawlings brothers were no saints, but their deaths felt too clean, too swift, like a predator taking down its prey. Jed had that predator's quiet about him. Brody turned and walked back into his office, the small, cramped space cluttered with wanted posters and dusty law books. He sat down at his desk, the wood worn smooth by years of use. He picked up a worn leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with his scrawled handwriting, a chronicle of the town's sins and sorrows. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the entries. Cattle rustling, claim jumping, drunken brawls, the usual litany of frontier transgressions. But lately, there'd been a different kind of trouble brewing in Salvation. A series of robberies, increasingly brazen and violent. The local gang, the Coyotes, were the obvious suspects, but Brody had no proof. They were like ghosts in the night, leaving no trace but fear and whispered rumors. He knew the Rawlings brothers had dealings with the Coyotes. Cletus, the elder, had a reputation for being a loose cannon, always itching for a fight, always looking for an easy score. Caleb the younger was more cautious, but easily swayed by his brother's influence. They were small-time crooks, not the kind to pull off the sophisticated robberies that had been plaguing the town. But they could have been pawns in a larger game, unwitting participants in something more sinister. Brody rubbed his weary eyes, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. He was the only law in Salvation, a town teetering on the edge of chaos. He needed to find the truth, to bring the real culprits to justice. But he was running out of time. The tension in the town was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. And Jed, with his silent rage and his quick trigger finger, was a walking inferno. He had a hunch that Jed's departure wasn't the end of this story, but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter he wasn't sure he was ready to write. He sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. He knew he needed to act quickly before the flames of vengeance consumed them all. The trail was faint, barely a whisper in the dust, but to Jed, it spoke volumes. Broken twigs, scuffed earth, the faint imprint of a horseshoe, the language of the land was as familiar to him as his own name. He followed the tracks, Beth's steady gait eating up the miles, the silence of the plains broken only by the rhythmic beat of hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the vastness of the prairie stretching out before him like an endless ocean. Bow! He made camp beside a dry creek bed, the silence of the night amplifying the sounds of the wilderness. The crackling of the fire, the rustling of the wind in the dry grass, the distant howl of a coyote, these were the sounds of his childhood, the sounds of the land had once called home. He woke before dawn, the sky still shrouded in darkness, the air crisp and cool. He saddled Bess, the leather creaking in the stillness, and rode on, the rising sun painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The tracks led him deeper into the wilderness, away from the familiar trails, into a land of canyons and arroyos, a land where the law was as scarce as water. Midday found him atop a rocky outcrop, the wind whipping at his worn duster. From his vantage point he could see for miles, the landscape a tapestry of browns and greens, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. He spotted a thin plume of smoke rising from a hidden valley below. A campfire. He nudged Bess forward, the reins loose in his hand, the horse picking its way carefully down the steep, rocky slope. As he drew closer, he could make out the figures gathered around the fire. 3 men, their faces obscured by the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. He recognized the horses tethered nearby, the same horses had seen outside the Apache camp, the day of the massacre. He dismounted, the silence of his arrival unnoticed by the men below. He tied Bess to a gnarled juniper tree, the reins looped loosely around a branch, and crept closer, the shadows of the rocks concealing his approach. He could hear their voices now, low and guttural, the words indistinguishable. He saw the glint of metal in the firelight, the barrel of a rifle, carelessly propped against a rock. He saw the fear in their eyes as they glanced nervously around, as if sensing his presence. He knew he had them. He was the predator, and they were the prey. The silence of the wilderness was his ally, the darkness his shield. He waited, patient and still, like a hawk circling its prey, ready to strike when the moment was right. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around him, obscuring his form, making him one with the shadows. The storm was coming. The wind howled a mournful tune through the canyons, as Jed moved like a phantom through the scrub brush. Head circled the men's camp, noting their carelessness, their unease. They weren't seasoned outlaws. They were scavengers, picking at the bones of a dying world. Had seen their kind before, cowardly in numbers, vicious alone. He needed to know their connection to the Apache raid. The faintest glint of moonlight on metal caught his eye. He moved closer, his boots silent on the dry earth. A narrow track, barely discernible, led away from the campfire, winding its way up the canyon wall. He followed it, his senses heightened, the silence of the wilderness amplifying every rustle, every snap of a twig. The track ended abruptly at the mouth of a mine shaft, the entrance shrouded in darkness. The air that seeped from its depths was stale, carrying the metallic tang of iron and the faint, sickly sweet scent of decay. Jed struck a match, the flickering flame illuminating the rough-hewn timbers that framed the entrance. The wood was old, weathered, but sturdy. This wasn't a recent dig. This mine had a history. He stepped inside, the match burning low, the darkness closing in around him. He lit a small lantern he carried, the soft glow revealing the extent of the mine shaft. It stretched into the darkness, the walls dripping with moisture, the air heavy with the weight of forgotten years. The ground was littered with debris, rusted tools, discarded clothing, empty whiskey bottles. This wasn't a working mine. It was a hideout. Further in, he found what he was looking for. A rough-hewn table, fashioned from a thick plank of wood balanced on two rocks. A lantern sat on the table, its wick burnt low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Scattered across the table were playing cards, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and a small, leather-bound pouch. Jed opened the pouch, the leather creaking in the silence. Inside, he found a handful of gold nuggets, their rough surfaces gleaming in the lantern light. Not enough to make a man rich, but enough to tempt a desperate one. He saw the bloodstains then, dark and crusted on the rough wooden surface of the table. He saw the discarded bandages, stained the same dark crimson. He ran a finger across the dried blood, the texture gritty beneath his touch. This wasn't the blood of a barroom brawl. This was the blood of something far more sinister. He knew then that Head found the answer he was looking for. The coyotes. They weren't just thieves. They were murderers. And they were involved in the Apache raid, somehow. The pieces were falling into place, the puzzle slowly revealing its grim picture. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't just about vengeance anymore. This was about justice. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was the only one who could deliver it. He left the mine shaft as silently as Head entered, the rising sun painting the eastern sky a fiery red. The coyotes were still asleep, oblivious to the danger that lurked just above them. He retrieved Bess, the mare's soft whicker a gentle greeting in the pre-dawn stillness. He mounted, the familiar weight of the saddle comforting beneath him, and rode back towards the camp, the reins loose in his hand, the horse's steady gait a rhythmic counterpoint to the pounding of his heart. He rode into the camp, just as the first rays of sunlight crested the canyon walls. The three men startled awake by his sudden appearance. They scrambled to their feet, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and confusion. Jed sat atop Bess, his silhouette framed against the rising sun, a figure of silent menace. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. His presence was enough. The leader of the gang, a hulking brute with a scarred face and a cruel glint in his eye, was the first to find his voice. "Jed," he rasped, the name a curse on his lips. "What brings you to our humble abode?" Jed's eyes swept over the three men, his gaze cold and unwavering. He saw the fear in their eyes, the desperation in their movements. He saw the guilt that gnawed at their souls. He didn't need a confession. He already knew the truth. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the leather pouch, the gold nuggets gleaming in the morning light. He tossed it at the leader's feet, the pouch landing with a soft thud in the dust. "Apache gold," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the words hanging heavy in the still morning air. The leader's eyes widened, his face paling beneath the grime. He glanced nervously at his companions, their faces mirroring his own fear. "We found it," he stammered, the lie thin and unconvincing. "Just lying there, after the incident." Jed's eyes narrowed, his gaze burning into the leader's soul. He didn't move, didn't speak. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Finally, the leader cracked. "All right," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We helped them, showed them the way, but we didn't kill anyone. We swear it." Yed remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He knew they were lying. Had seen the bloodstains in the mine, the discarded bandages. He knew they'd been involved in the massacre, somehow. He didn't need to know the details. Their guilt was etched on their faces, plain for all to see. He drew his coat, the metal gleaming in the sunlight, the movement smooth and practiced. The three men flinched, their eyes wide with terror, their hands trembling. They knew what was coming. They'd seen it in Jed's eyes and the cold, hard set of his jaw. They'd heard it in the silence that preceded the storm. The first shot rang out, shattering the stillness of the morning, echoing through the canyons. The leader crumpled to the ground, a crimson stain blooming on his chest. The other two men didn't have time to react. Two more shots, two more bodies fall into the dust. The silence returned, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the faint metallic scent of gunpowder. Jed holstered his coat, the movement deliberate and precise. He looked down at the bodies lying at his feet, their eyes. He looked down at the bodies lying at his feet, their eyes staring blankly up at the unforgiving sky. Justice. A hollow word in this desolate land. He turned Bess and rode away, leaving the vultures to their grim task. He didn't look back. He rode for days, the landscape blurring into a monotonous tapestry of rock and sky. He stopped only to rest Bess and replenish his meager supplies. He ate sparingly, slept little, the memories of the massacre haunting his dreams. He saw Sarah's face, her eyes wide with terror, her screams echoing in his ears. He saw the flames engulfing his home, the smoke billowing black against the twilight sky. He saw the bodies of his neighbors, their faces frozen in silent agony. He arrived in Salvation, a dusty, windswept town clinging precariously to the edge of civilization, just as the sun was setting. The town was quiet, the streets deserted, the only sign of life, the faint glow of lamplight emanating from the windows of the saloon. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, the wooden sign creaking ominously in the evening breeze. He pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. Sheriff Brody was sitting behind his desk, his feet propped up, a half-empty bottle of whiskey perched precariously on the edge. He looked up, his eyes bleary and unfocused, his face etched with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much. "Yed," he said, his voice slurred, the name a question rather than a greeting. Jed nodded, his gaze steady and unwavering. He didn't waste words. "Coyotes," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Apache raid." Brody's eyes narrowed, the alcohol-induced haze momentarily dispelled. "Coyotes," he repeated, the word a curse on his lips. "They're back?" Jed nodded again. "3 of them. North Canyon. I took care of it." Brody sighed, the weariness returning to his eyes. Yed, he muttered, shaking his head slowly. "You and your methods. You know this ain't gonna bring her back." Jed didn't respond. He knew Brody was right. Nothing would bring Sarah back. Nothing would erase the memories of that horrific night. But he had to do something. He had to try. "They were involved," Jed said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Supplied the Apache with weapons. Showed them the way." Brody sat up straighter, his eyes now sharp and focused. "You got proof?" Jed reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the leather pouch, the gold nuggets gleaming dully in the lamplight. He tossed it onto Brody's desk, the pouch landing with a soft thud. "Apache gold," he said. "Found it in their hideout." Brody picked up the pouch, his fingers tracing the outline of the nuggets through the leather. He looked at Jed, his gaze searching and intense. "This changes things," he said, his voice low and serious. "This could be enough to bring down the whole damn gang." A flicker of something akin to hope ignited in Jed's heart. Maybe, just maybe, he could finally get some real justice for Sarah, for his neighbors, for himself. He looked at Brody, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Then do it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Bring them down." Brody nodded, his eyes hardening with resolve. "I will, Jed," he said, his voice firm and resolute. I will, Jed," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "I give you my word." Jed nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the sheriff's vow. He turned to leave, his body heavy with exhaustion, his spirit weary from the burden of vengeance. Head delivered justice, but at what cost? "Jed," Brody called out, his voice softer now. "You look like hell. Stay the night. Get some rest." Jed hesitated. The thought of sleep, of surrendering to the oblivion of dreams, both tempted and terrified him. But he knew Brody was right. He needed rest. He nodded again, a curt gesture of acceptance, and turned back towards the sheriff. Brody gestured towards a cot in the corner of the room. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, a hint of concern in his voice. "He'll get you some water and a blanket." Jed lay down on the cot, the rough canvas scratching against his skin. He closed his eyes, the images of the massacre flooding his mind. Sarah's face, contorted in terror. The flames consuming his home. The lifeless bodies of his neighbors. He opened his eyes again, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight. A sharp pain shot through his side, a searing reminder of the fight in the canyon. Head ignored the wound, the adrenaline masking the pain. But now, with the fight over, the full force of the injury hit him. He sat up, his hand instinctively going to his side, his fingers probing the wound beneath his shirt. He felt the sticky warmth of blood, the ragged edges of torn flesh. Had been so focused on his mission, on delivering justice, that he hadn't even realized how badly he had been hurt. Brody returned, a tin cup of water and a thick wool blanket in his hands. He saw the bloodstains on Jed's shirt, the pallor of his face. "Damn it, Jed," he muttered, setting down the water and blanket. "Let me see that." Jed reluctantly pulled up his shirt, revealing the deep gash in his side. Brody whistled softly. "That's a nasty one," he said, his voice grim. "You should have said something." He cleaned the wound as best he could, the lamplight casting long dancing shadows on the walls of the small office. He bandaged it tightly, his touch gentle despite the gruffness of his demeanor. "You need a doctor," he said, his voice laced with concern. "This needs stitching." Jed shook his head. "It'll be fine," he rasped, his voice weak. "Just need some rest." Brody knew better than to argue. He knew Jed's stubbornness, his refusal to admit weakness. He helped him lie back down on the cot, covering him with the blanket. "Try to sleep," he said, his voice softer now. "Tomorrow's another day." Jed closed his eyes, the exhaustion finally overwhelming him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain in his side a constant reminder of the price of vengeance. He saw Sarah's face again, but this time, her expression was different. She wasn't screaming. She was smiling. A peaceful, serene smile that warmed him from the inside out. He reached out to her, his hand outstretched, but she faded away, leaving him alone in the darkness. He slept then, a deep, dreamless sleep, the first real rest Head had in days. The price of vengeance had been high, but perhaps, just perhaps, it had finally bought him some measure of peace. He woke to the sound of birdsong, the morning sun streaming through the grimy window of the sheriff's office. The pain in his side was a dull ache now, a bearable reminder of the fight. Brody was gone, leaving a plate of beans and a fresh pot of coffee on the desk. He ate slowly, savoring the simple food, the warmth of the coffee spreading through his chilled body. He needed to go back. He needed to bury them. He saddled Bess, the mare's soft whicker a welcome sound in the quiet morning. He rode back towards the canyon, the landscape familiar yet alien, the memories of the massacre clinging to the rocks and trees like a shroud. He arrived at the burned-out shell of his home, the charred timbers reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, a bitter reminder of the violence that had ripped through this peaceful valley. He found them near the creek, where they often played, their small bodies huddled together as if for warmth. He dismounted, his legs stiff and sore, and knelt beside them. He gently brushed the dirt and debris from their faces, their eyes closed in eternal slumber. Had carved 3 small wooden crosses the night before the raid, intending to mark the graves of the 3 apple saplings Head planted by the creek. Now, they would serve a different purpose. He dug their graves with his bare hands, the earth hard and unforgiving, the task of physical manifestation of the grief that gnawed at his soul. He placed them gently in the earth, their small hands clasped together, their faces turned towards the rising sun. He planted the crosses at the head of each grave, the rough wood a stark contrast to the delicate wildflowers that grew along the creek bank. He stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees, the mournful cry of a distant hawk. He said a silent prayer, a plea for forgiveness, for peace, for understanding in a world that seemed determined to offer none. He didn't understand why. Why them? Why his Sarah? Why his little girls? There were no answers in the wind, only the echoes of his own despair. He covered their graves with stones, a small cairn against the ravages of time and weather. He knew it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. But it was all he could do. It was all he had left. He mounted Bess, the mare sensing his grief, her soft whicker a silent offering of comfort. He looked back at the small graves, the crosses standing sentinel against the vast, indifferent sky. He didn't know where he was going, what he would do. He only knew that he couldn't stay here, in this place of sorrow and loss. He turned Bess and rode away, leaving the ghosts of his past behind, the silence of the canyon, a fitting epitaph for the lives that had been so cruelly taken. The West remained wild, indifferent to the small tragedies that played out within its vast embrace. But in the silent burial by the creek, a small measure of peace had been found, a fragile flower blooming in the desolate landscape of loss. The sun was high, bleaching the canyon a bone white when Sheriff Brody rode up. Bess nickered a low greeting, her ears twitching. Jed didn't turn. He stood by the creek, staring at the water, the rippling surface reflecting the fractured pieces of his soul. He heard the creak of leather, the thud of boots on the dry earth. Brody stopped a few paces behind him, his silence heavy with unspoken words. Finally he cleared his throat, the sound rough and dry. Jed didn't respond. He didn't need to. Brody knew why he was here. Found some things, Brody said, his voice low. Things that paint a clearer picture. Jed slowly turned, his eyes meeting Brody's. They were the eyes of a man who had walked through the fires of hell and emerged on the other side, scarred but unbroken. Brody shifted his weight, the jingle of his spurs a nervous counterpoint to the silence. Seems those coyotes weren't alone in their enterprise. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Seems they had a partner, Doyle. A silent one, providing information, supplies. A man named Caleb. Yed's eyes narrowed, a flicker of understanding in their depths. Caleb, Cowboy, his neighbor, the man who had shared his table, laughed with his children, borrowed his tools, The man he had trusted. Brody continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Seems Caleb owed a considerable debt. A debt he couldn't pay. So he made a deal. Information for leniency. Your family, your neighbors, they were collateral. Jed didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth was a cold, hard stone in his gut. He had taken vengeance on the wrong men. He had delivered his own brand of justice, but it had been misdirected, fueled by grief and rage. Brody sighed, the sound heavy with regret. I should have known. Should have looked deeper. Caleb's gone. Skipped town soon after the incident. Took what he could and vanished. Yet finally spoke, his voice raw and cracked. Justice, the word tasted like ash in his mouth. Ain't always clean, Jed, Brody said, his gaze steady. Especially out here. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He tossed it to Jed, who caught it reflexively. It was heavy, the weight of gold coins pressing against his palm. Caleb's stash. Figure it belongs to the families now. What's left of them? Jed looked at the pouch, then back at Brody. He saw understanding in the sheriff's eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the rough justice he had meted out. You need to go, Jed, Brody said, his voice soft but firm. This town ain't big enough for the ghosts you carry. Start over. Find some peace. Jed nodded, a single, curt movement. He knew Brody was right. There was nothing left for him here. Only ghosts and memories and the bitter taste of misplaced vengeance. He mounted Bess, the mare shifting restlessly beneath him, sensing his need to leave. He looked back at the canyon, at the small crosses marking the graves of his loved ones. He offered a silent farewell, a promise to carry their memory with him, to find a way to live with the burden of his past. He turned Bess and rode away, the setting sun casting long shadows across the desolate landscape, a silent testament to the harsh realities of the West. Dust devils danced across the parched earth, swirling red and brown against the dying light. Jed, let Bess have her head. The mare steady gay a rhythm against the silence. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The ghosts rode with him, whispering in the wind, their presence a constant ache in his soul. He rode for days, lost in the vastness of the plains, the horizon a shimmering mirage that constantly receded before him. He slept under the stars, the cold ground his bed, the vast, indifferent sky his only companion. He ate sparingly, the jerky and hardtack a meager sustenance against the gnawing hunger. He spoke to no one, the silence a balm against the clamor of his thoughts. He crossed rivers swollen with spring melt, navigated canyons choked with dust, and climbed mountains that scraped the sky. He saw the tracks of buffalo, the circling flight of vultures, the lonely smoke of distant campfires. He was a ghost himself, drifting through the landscape, a specter of the man he once was. One evening, he found himself on the outskirts of a small town, nestled in the foothills of a distant mountain range. The town was a collection of ramshackle buildings, huddled together against the vastness of the plains, a fragile outpost of civilization against the encroaching wilderness. He hesitated, the urge to ride on, to remain lost in the anonymity of the plains, warring with the need for human contact, for a respite from the solitude. He rode into town, Bess' hooves echoing in the deserted streets. The saloon doors swung open, spilling a wash of light and noise into the twilight. He dismounted, the stiffness in his legs a reminder of the miles he'd ridden. He tied Bess to the hitching post, the mare's soft wicker, a small comfort in the unfamiliar surroundings. He entered the saloon, the smell of stale beer and whiskey thick in the air. The room was dimly lit, the faces of the patrons obscured by shadows. He found a seat at the bar, the rough wood cool against his calloused hands. He ordered a whiskey, the fiery liquid burning a path down his throat, a momentary distraction from the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He sat there for a long time, nursing his drink, watching the play of light and shadow on the faces around him. He didn't speak, his silence a shield against the curious glances, the unspoken questions. He was a stranger in a strange land, a ghost seeking solace in the anonymity of the crowd. A woman approached him, her movements graceful, her eyes dark and knowing. She sat beside him, the scent of lavender clinging to her clothes, a stark contrast to the harsh smells of the saloon. She didn't speak, her presence a silent invitation, a flicker of warmth in the cold, empty space that surrounded him. He met her gaze, his own eyes mirroring the weariness, the quiet understanding that comes from having seen too much, lost too much. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost in the quiet intimacy of her presence, the silence between them a language more profound than words. He knew he couldn't stay. He knew he had to keep moving, to keep searching for the elusive peace that seemed forever beyond his reach. But for a brief moment, in the dim light of the saloon, in the company of a stranger who understood the language of silence, he found a flicker of hope, a fragile ember glowing in the ashes of his past. The West remained wild, unforgiving, but in the small kindness of a stranger, in the shared silence of two souls, adrift in the vastness of the plains, Jed found a small measure of solace.